Good evening, everybody. We've reached the fourth in these studies on the kingship of heaven, and we've reached the book of Daniel. But I do want to give us a little bit of a reminder of the journey we've made so far. If you remember, when we started, I encouraged you to consider that the biblical word often translated kingdom would be better translated kingship. And that's the theme I've been trying to follow. In the first study, we went from Exodus to Numbers to 2 Samuel to 1 Kings. I'm not going to go back through it all, but that's the picture, that's the journey we've been going. We then reached the Psalms. And there was 4 Psalms where the word kingship or kingdom appeared. The one at the bottom in grey is there to remind you that we looked at it because there are lots of passages in the Bible that talk about the kingship of God, but never use that term. And for the sake of fitting it all in far easier, I'm sticking mostly with the passages where that word appears, kingship or kingdom. So that's what we're working on. Then last time we looked at the kingship of God in the latter prophets, the Jewish section called the latter prophets. And there was 2 passages in Isaiah and one in Micah and one in Obadiah. So let's review that journey from this graphic that I left you with at the end. If you remember, I said where the Star of David is roughly where Abraham started. Where the crown is where we'll be when Jesus comes back. And the profile there is the shape of the history of Israel, roughly hand-drawn, not in detail. So where's our journey taken us? It's taken us through those. Moses is responsible for the first 2 references. David and Solomon were being spoken to by God for the second 2. The Psalms, most of them were by David, so I've squeezed them in there. And last time we looked at 3 latter prophets. So the shape was, in time of Moses, we were looking forward and that Israel was traveling uphill. By the time of Solomon, it had really reached its height. The latter prophets were speaking of things going badly wrong, and yet still promising this kingdom. So what happens after the latter prophets? Well, I'm sure most of you will know, Jerusalem falls and the Jews are exiled in Babylon. And that is really a low point in the history of Israel. And then this is where we are today. This is where Daniel sits, right at that low point. And that's where we're looking at. But I want to point out one thing, that even when he was in that place, through God's wisdom, he could still see the coming king. And this, in many ways, it was the problem for the Jews ever since. Because they expected, really, once they came out of Babylon, to be on that steady upward climb to when Messiah returns. And we'll see a little bit later what happens, because that isn't the journey they travel. So that's where we are in Old Testament history. We're in the Babylonian exile, a dark point for Israel, but Daniel is seeing the king coming back. I'm fairly convinced that it's safe to say the book of Daniel is to the Old Testament what the book of Revelation is to the New Testament. Right? The first 7 chapters of Daniel provide practical examples, and I'll say this slowly because I want you to take it in, of how the faithful should live as part of a society under judgment. I'll repeat that. They provide practical examples of how the faithful should live as part of a society under judgment. The second 7 chapters warn of future troubles while promising the ultimate victory of one like a son of man who will establish the Lord's kingship on earth. And in the book of Revelation, that practical guidance comes in the first 3 chapters, and the rest of it warns of the coming tribulations, followed by the return of the King of Kings. So Daniel really is to the Old Testament what Revelation is to the New. Now, I'm not going to work through that, but I've just put them up there. If anybody wants to stop the video in future and have a look, there's a summary of all the chapters. What I do want to mention is the 2 headings. The first 7 chapters, I've given the heading of engagement with human authority. And that goes 2 ways for Daniel and his friends. There are times when they're in great danger and they have to rely on the Lord to deliver them. And at other times, Daniel finds himself, and they do, in a position of influence and power. But they were all part of a Jewish nation that was living under judgment. And that's the first half, and it's mainly there. I'll explain in a minute. We're mainly in that section tonight. The revelations from heaven, if you remember last time, and I think Tom asked me why the Jews don't put Daniel in the prophets. I've found one reason, there may be others, but one reason is they don't consider his revelations to be prophecy like the other prophets. And to put it simply, Isaiah, Jeremiah, etc. were warning of future judgment if they did not repent. And they were calling people to repentance. In Daniel, it is not a warning of the need to repent. It is a warning of troubles coming, whatever God's people do. These troubles are not conditional. In Daniel, the troubles are, these will happen before the Messiah comes back. And that's an important difference. But that's often how people divide this book. There is another way, which is the linguistic approach. And the first chapter and 3.5 verses are in Hebrew. From nearly the start of chapter 2 to the end of chapter 7 is in Aramaic. And the last 12, isn't it? Yeah. Last 5 chapters are all in Hebrew. And so it divides like that. Now, one reason I want to share that with you tonight is because we look at the passages I'm going to be taking you to in a bit more detail. All of them occur in the Aramaic section. The ones which are in bold type, if that stands out on your monitor, are the ones where the word kingdom is used. The ones that are in italics are the ones where it's talking about the kingdom, but not using the word. And that's true of the last passage we'll have a brief look at, because I wanted to end up on a very solemn but high note. So most of the passages we're looking at are in the Aramaic section of Daniel. So, whistle-top tour of the book of Daniel. Just to remind you that the introduction tells us that Daniel and his friends were nobles. They were young nobles, and they were amongst the first people to be taken by Nebuchadnezzar to Babylon before Jerusalem was destroyed, probably at the same time as Ezekiel. Daniel arrives, and he's got Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, who were later given other names that you probably know better. And these 4 young men declined to eat the king's food, but said they just wanted to eat vegetables. And I'm sure you know the steward was a bit worried about that, but God honored their faith, and he gave them knowledge and skill, and because of that, they prospered. So God responds to their faithfulness in this very tricky situation. The next chapter we need just a bit more look at, because this is the famous dream of Nebuchadnezzar. It troubles him so much that he refuses to describe it to his magicians, astrologers, sorcerers, and Chaldean advisors. He sets them a real test. He says, I've had a really troubling dream. You tell me what was in the dream, and then interpret it to me. And they threw their arms up in the air and they said, that's impossible. And Nebuchadnezzar said, well, then you must all be fakes. I'm going to kill you. But Daniel was included in that number, and he only heard about it afterwards. And I hadn't really picked this up before, but it hit me this time round. When he heard about it, he went back to tell his three friends, and they sought mercies from the God of heaven. And the Lord revealed the details to Daniel, who then sought an audience with the king. And this is what he told him. You, O king, are a king of kings, for the God of heaven has given you a kingdom, power, strength, and glory. But after you shall arise another kingdom, inferior to yours, then another, a third of bronze, which shall rule over all the earth. And the fourth kingdom shall be as strong as iron, inasmuch as iron breaks in pieces and shatters everything. And like iron that crushes, that kingdom will break in pieces and crush all the others. Whereas you saw the feet and toes, partly of potter's clay and partly of iron, the kingdom shall be divided. Yet the strength of the iron shall be in it, just as you saw the iron mixed with chromatic clay. And as the toes of the feet were partly of iron and partly of clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly fragile. And in the days of these kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed, and the kingdom shall not be left to another people. It shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. Now, I don't know whether you saw the rock fly in there to hit the statue, but I'm sure you know the story. It's of a stone which hits the feet of the thing and the whole thing falls. It's a well-known story, but I just want to pick up that bit I've underlined and give it a meaning, you see, because in this dream, Nebuchadnezzar has been told he's built this wonderful empire, but it's not going to last. It's going to come to an end. And after it, there'll be three more kingdoms, and every one of them will come to an end. But this kingdom, this kingship, which God establishes, will last forever. And that is one of the great promises that comes out of this book, that the kingdom of God, the kingship of God, shall last forever. So, moving on, chapter 3. His three friends, better known as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, all refused to worship the king's gold image that he sets up. And I'm sure you know, it's a well-known Sunday school story. They were thrown into a furnace, and the Lord sent an angel to deliver them. And at the end of this episode, in verse 29, we get a wonderful confession by Nebuchadnezzar. He sends out a decree to protect the Jews everywhere, because there is no other God who can deliver like this. We have a God. If we're living in times of judgment and persecution which arises because of it, who can deliver us like no other. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego said to Nebuchadnezzar, our God will deliver us. And if he doesn't, we will not bow down and worship your image, because he still is God. And that's just perhaps a point for us. The confidence we need in God in times when judgment is happening around us. Now, this is going to be a bit longer than the previous 3 chapters. We are now into one of the strangest chapters of the Bible. I think it's really strange. Do you remember the account? Nebuchadnezzar has a dream, but he ends up writing about that dream to everybody. And this is the basic outline of why he does it. The chapter starts with this. It's the beginning of his letter. It's not the beginning of the account. It's the beginning of a letter he sends to all his kingdom. And he says, Nebuchadnezzar, the king, to all peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth, peace be multiplied to you. I thought it good to declare to you the signs and wonders that the Most High God has worked for me. How great are his signs, and how mighty are his wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and his dominion is from generation to generation. So here is Nebuchadnezzar telling everybody he rules over that the God of heaven, the Most High God, has an everlasting kingship. Remember, we've just seen that Nebuchadnezzar had been told that his kingship would not be everlasting. But here he's confessing that God's is. What caused him to do that? Well, he relates how he had a dream which troubled him. He called his magicians and all the others, told them the dream this time, but they couldn't do it. Then Daniel, who's called the chief of the magicians, arrived, and the king told him the whole dream because he recognized that the spirit of the holy God was in Daniel. And in his dream, just to remind you, he saw a great tree which sheltered the whole world. Then an angelic watcher appeared and decreed that the tree must be cut down, but the stump had to be left with an iron band around it. The messenger then commanded that for 7 years he will have his human mind taken away and will eat grass like ox. This in order that the living may know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men. Now, that's not a reference directly through the word kingship, but the Most High ruling is a reference to God's kingship. So back at verse 17 of the chapter, we read, this decision is by decree of the watchers, and the centers by the word of the holy ones, in order that the living may know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men, gives it to whoever he wills, and sets over it the lowest of men. So this is Nebuchadnezzar back describing his dream and what he dreamt, having had Daniel tell him, having started relating the things and how his dream began, he now tells us the end of that dream. Daniel steps in and tells him what the interpretation is. He says, O king, and this is the decree of the Most High, which has come upon my lord the king. They shall drive you from your dwelling, they shall drive you from men. Your dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field, and they shall make you eat grass like oxen. They shall wet you with the dew of heaven, and 7 times shall pass over you, till you know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men and gives it to whoever he chooses. There's a refrain in this chapter. I hope you're spotting it. He carries on in verse 24 to 27. And inasmuch as they gave the command to leave the stump and the roots of the tree, your kingdom shall be assured to you after you come to know that heaven rules. And then he advises Nebuchadnezzar to take this dream seriously and to be humble before God. But guess what? Nebuchadnezzar didn't. In verse 28 onwards, we discover what came upon him. At the end of 12 months, he was walking about the royal palace of Babylon. The king spoke, saying, "Is this not the great Babylon that I have built for a royal dwelling by my mighty power and for the honor of my majesty?" While the word was still in the king's mouth, a voice fell from heaven. And this is Nebuchadnezzar relating this in his letter, remember. "King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is spoken, the kingdom has departed from you, and they shall drive you from men, and your dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field. They shall make you eat grass like an oxen, and 7 times they shall pass over you, until you know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men and gives it to whoever he chooses." It's that theme again. This chapter wants to get this home to us. We need to understand that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men and he chooses who looks after it. Just one other comment here. It talks here a couple of times about they driving him from men and they making him eat grass. Was that other men? I suspect not. I think it's these angelic or spirit watchers that are described earlier. And they, of course, can be good angels or they can be the bad demonic angels. But that's my feeling about that. But we must press on. You can come back in question time in a few minutes and ask me a bit more about that or challenge me on it. And then it says that very hour the word was fulfilled concerning Nebuchadnezzar, and he was driven from men and ate grass like oxen. His body was wet with the dew of heaven till his hair had grown like eagle's feathers and his nails like bird claws. What a strange thing to happen to an emperor, an all-powerful emperor. And then moving on, it says at the end of the time, Nebuchadnezzar, so it's his words again, lifted up to my eyes to heaven, and my understanding returned to me. And I blessed the Most High and praised and honored him who lives forever. For his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom is from generation to generation. Incredible. Nebuchadnezzar has a similar experience to the young man in the New Testament we call the prodigal son. He comes to his senses. He has a complete change of heart, like the Apostle Paul. He humbles himself before God and recognizes and agrees with what God had already told him previously. But now his heart was in it. And he continues, therefore, all the inhabitants of the earth are reputed as nothing. He does according to his will in the army of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth. No one can restrain his hand or say to him, "What have you done?" Nebuchadnezzar had really seen it here, hadn't he? He'd got a message about God. And then he goes on to relate that his reason returned to him, he regained his kingdom, and he was back in his royal position. But then he says, "Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol the honor of the King of heaven, all of whose works are truth and his ways are justice. And those who walk in pride he is able to put down." Nebuchadnezzar had a real encounter with God. He'd had a real conversion. And now he's witnessing to that, not just to 1 or 2 people. But this is a brave letter for a man who's been a loony for 7 years. He's been cast out of society. And he comes back and he writes a letter like this. This is a letter of faith. And he says, this God is far greater than all of us. And his ways are truth. His ways are justice. His works are truth. You better take notice of him. Here is a historical figure who is well known, but not much about this in the world's histories, but it is in God's history, that he humbled himself before God. He had to go through the mill. He didn't take the easy way. He had the opportunity. So at the end of chapter 4, I want to give you one important note. It's this. This chapter, unlike all the others passages we've been looking at, is not about God's kingship, which is to come. It is about his kingship, which is now. And that's an important point. We often hear, and the doctrine known as kingdom now is not this, but there is a kingship of God, which is now. We often say he's sovereign. God is sovereign over everything. Well, this is what it means. He's absolutely in control of everything that's happening. So we've reached that point, folks. It's halfway break. It's time for you to ask your questions, make your comments and such things. I'm going to stop the screen share so we can see one another. And it's over to you. Have I provoked some thoughts? Have I given you plenty to chew on? Anybody want to come back and say, I don't quite see that? It's your time for a few minutes, and then we've got a bit more of Daniel to do.
Hi, it's Brian here. It's interesting, some of the points you made, the time of oppression, because, well, a few comments I had. I mean, we know the names of them. They had Jewish names: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and I forgot the other one now.
Yeah.
And the names that they were actually given were an anathema to them. They were actually given all pagan god names, such as but actually Daniel was called Belshazzar, which means Baal save the king, which he changed to Belteshazzar, which sort of feminizes it and makes it a nonsense. Similarly, all the other names were slightly skewed just so that they could mention them, because of course if you ask a Jew to name any pagan deities, there'll be a thunderous silence, because they're actually prohibited by the laws. I think it's the Levitical laws from actually saying a name. So it must have been a real time of oppression for them. They weren't allowed to actually say their names. What was the other point I had about it? I don't think we can fully appreciate how dangerous the times were. I mean, we know about the three of them being thrown into the fire and Daniel in the lion's den, and also that Daniel was forced to display his faith by not worshipping an image, which is something that we've got to face at some stage in the future, according to Revelation as well, when an image is established. Absolutely. And people are called upon to worship it.
Yeah.
And not only that, you draw a few parallels. I mean, Nebuchadnezzar, for all his power, because there were plenty of pagan deities they worship. One of them, Marduk, even with his power, after bearing witness like this and declaring that there was no God like the God of Daniel, even then the whole of the society still insisted on worshipping these pagan deities. It's a testimony that Nebuchadnezzar was able to influence society, or at least allow Daniel and the Jews to influence society. That it was the Magi that came from Persia as a legacy of this, that actually announced to the pagan Herod that the king of the Jews was born. You mentioned as well about the similarities for Nebuchadnezzar. I'm sorry, I didn't jot them down, but there's one that's occurred to me as well, is that rather like the character whose name was Legion. You mentioned about being chased out by demonic forces. Well, Legion was chased out of society, and it was only when the demons were cast out of him that he tried to follow Jesus and was told, no, go back and bear witness to your own people. Those are just a few comments that occurred to me listening to you.
Good. Anybody else got anything that's occurred to them?
Just going on to the naming thing again.
Mary's off camera.
Oh, sorry, I'm here. Just about the naming, it struck me that they were trying to remove their identity that's rooted in God, because I have looked them up in the past. I can't remember them all now. The Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah have all got God in their meaning. And it struck me that they were basically being put through a re-education program. And you know, that a
denial program.
Yeah, a thought. What do they call them in China? Thought cleansing program. Yeah. And yet they determined that they purposed in their heart they were going to stay faithful, and they refused to be defiled. And that really encouraged me that even in that climate, you can be solid and firm in God if you're determined to be.
Well, thank you.
I think even with Nebuchadnezzar's, he appears to be, when he begins, he mentions your God. The first few chapters he talks, he was obviously still believing in the other gods. By the time we get to this point, he appears to be at least acknowledging the high God. So whether he's still acknowledging other gods or not, we don't know. But we know from the very next chapter that as soon as he dies, it's all back to square one. So all of these human kingships and kingdoms, we all know what happens to them. You know, there's only one that's eternal.
Yeah, the point you raise is interesting. Nebuchadnezzar, for all his power, he still ended up having to put his own two sons to death because they tried to overthrow him, and had someone weak. Was it Nabonidus who married his daughter as the only one to carry on his legacy? And of course, their son was Belshazzar, who came to a sticky end.
We'll get to that in a minute. Anyone else?
Well, there is just one controversial point, not like me to make a controversial point. I've just been reading today how some think that when we look in the book of Revelation and see a scroll and a little book, that some think because of the incredible similarity between Daniel and Revelation, that it is actually talking about the book of Daniel. But there's just something to think about. It's vital for the understanding of Revelation.
Yeah,
I was going to one point. The period of 7 times is, I think it's equivalent to 3.5 years, because they used to have in Babylonia, they split the year into 2. They used to say they sojourn in Babylon for half of the year, and I've forgotten the other main city where they would sojourn for the other half of the year. I believe that's, you can always correct me if I'm wrong, but that's
I've not heard it before. I've not heard that before, so I'd like to find the reference.
I think it's in Bill Cooper's Authenticity of the Book of Daniel that you might come across it. Anyway, whatever maybe it points to the notion that there's 3.5 years of a truce that appears in Revelation before the truce is broken. Perhaps that's just idle speculation.
Anybody else? Okay.